Minnesota. First and foremost, open and concealed carry are one and the same. If you get a permit, it covers both. Then if you're carrying in public without a permit, it's considered a gross misdemeanor. Now, eligibility, you have to be 21 years or older. In some states, it's 18. You have to be a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident. One of the big things is you have to provide evidence of training. In safe handgun use, it needs to be from a certified instructor.
I want to push back on that only because these two scenarios that I'm specifically thinking of is the Minnesota recent shooting where the guy is on the ground on his knees, one hand with his phone, and then the other hand is on the ground bracing himself. Whereas these people at January 6th, they were brandishing weapons and actually physically hitting cops and security. Very eerily similar where there were protests, but one was quite violent and not a lot of mass deaths from it. It's just hard to swallow to think that these two scenarios had such different outcomes and results, and that people are trying to wrap their minds around it and just make it fit their narrative on both sides.
Obviously, I can really feel for the individual in Minnesota who lost his life, and that's a tragedy. And I look at what was going on with the ICE agents, and I think, were they properly trained? Did they get enough sleep? Was it the fact that he was not complying and resisting just a little bit and somebody saw a gun? At what point did somebody feel there was a threat?
Medicine,
Law, friendship. This is Dr. Long and Lawyer Nik. You're listening to the Medico-Legal Brief.
one doctor, one lawyer, and a whole lot of gray area. Welcome back to another episode of the Medical Legal Brief here with Dr. Long and Lawyer Nik. I'm really interested to hear what Lawyer Nik has to say today because it's going to be his episode to shine because we're going to talk about a lot of the legal jargon about gun laws and gun rules and have that conversation that we've been meaning to have for quite some time now.
Like when we're talking guns and firearms, it's definitely an interesting topic. It's a polarizing topic, depending on where you're at in the United States or even the world. The United States is very different as we lead the charge in gun ownership. And we just have a variety of laws that exist throughout the states. There's some things out there in society that are misunderstood and other things that are brought to the forefront in politics or in current events. It's just a good topic overall.
Whether you own guns or not, or whether you like guns or not, it's unfortunately something that everyone has to deal with and understand the legalities behind, and that's why this episode will be really good. But before we get into the episode, I do want to make sure that anyone who has not already, if you haven't followed, liked, shared our content, please make sure you do. We're on Spotify, YouTube. Please find us on social media and get a hold of us.
So Long, with that, where do you want to start?
Obviously, with recent current events and a couple of things going on in Minnesota, that's what has brought this conversation to the forefront for me. I want to understand gun laws a little bit better. I personally do not own a gun. My husband does own a gun, and I understand the rules behind keeping things safe at home with our young kids. But I'm curious and trying to understand more what the legalities are with different states, what the rules are to carry, concealed carry, open carry. Like, what are those differences? What are the ramifications if you don't follow the rules and so forth?
Of course, and there are a variety of legalities that revolve around firearms. And with current events, it's very interesting because with what happened with Minnesota, when we go back to what happened with Charlie Kirk, regardless of whether you're red or blue, on which side of the issue, guns impact everybody, just like you said. You have to go through life in this current day and age with the mindset that anybody and everybody could be armed, whether they have a firearm in their home, whether they have a firearm in their car, whether they have a firearm on their person. It's something to where it impacts everybody. And it's actually surprising when you start talking gun ownership, at least here in Texas, where we have very, let's say, liberal laws when it comes to guns. No pun intended there, but when you talk to your neighbor, the sweet old woman down the street, or the 21-year-old college girl, or the gruff-looking guy who just got out of the military, gun ownership opinions run the gambit, where that college girl or that elderly woman might be very on board with having a gun to where they conceal carry themselves, and the gruff old, vet might have a different opinion because of his interactions with weapons in the past. So it's cool to get everybody's opinions, but it can be a very divisive argument if you don't have the right conversation and you're not going into it with an open mind.
Do you think that that is a very much an American issue or American conversation that we need to have? Or do you think that in general across the world, this is something that should be talked more and discussed more?
I think It's more so an American issue. I don't have the stats in front of me, but I'm pretty sure we lead in gun violence. Like we lead the stats in gun violence. We lead the stats in mass shootings. We lead the stats in suicide and domestic violence with the use of firearms. It's an American issue, but also the ownership of firearms is instilled in our history. And with it being instilled in our history, something from 300 years ago, things have evolved and firearms have evolved and opinions on firearms have evolved. We need to figure it out for ourselves. I've traveled all over the world just like you have. And some countries that I've been to, absolutely no guns, no problem with guns. But what you have to worry about is everybody having a knife and possibly being stabbed. In other areas, guns are all over the place. You start going to maybe third world countries and people have weapons, whether they're using it for protection or hunting or crime. In certain areas of the Middle East, you can be walking through the market and they're trying to sell you AK-47s right there in the middle of the local market. To bring it back to the question that you asked, we need to figure out what it is for Americans. And I don't think opinions of other countries or the opinions of foreigners should really be able to impact that just by the very base that it's instilled in our history as a country.
Of course, you're referencing the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, but I want to make sure the viewers understand that we are coming in with some bias because we all have a different comfort level with firearms and guns. And so, Nik, you are a gun owner. I believe
Yes.
you mentioned that in a previous episode. I personally am not a gun owner, but I am closely involved and around gun owners. And again, my husband owns several guns. I have access to them and know how to use them. And I've gone out to gun ranges to fire certain types of guns. Both of us have some knowledge and some experience with handling and managing.
To start with my history with firearms, when I was growing up in Chicago, my parents weren't used to firearms. They didn't own a gun, they owned a BB gun. And realistically, they just didn't have a lot of interaction with them. My dad wasn't a hunter. Overall, it just wasn't a thing back then. And then when we moved to Texas, that's when things changed because culturally, everybody in Texas has a gun. I think when you're looking at firearms in Texas, the first step is hunting. There are a lot of hunters in Texas, whether it's deer, whether it's duck, whether it's dove. Back in the day, you could roll around with your shotgun or your rifle in the back of your truck and it wouldn't be a problem. It was just kind of cultural experience. That ended up being my first interaction with a firearm was going in the Boy Scouts, learning how to hunt. I got a 22 rifle. My dad took me out and we went hunting for squirrels and rabbits and he taught me the appropriate way how to use a firearm. He taught me how to be safe with them, taught me what not to do. That was very important in the journey of understanding guns. And then when I made the determination that I wanted to get into law enforcement via the FBI, I decided, okay, I really want to understand how to handle a handgun, a pistol, because I knew that if I was going to go on that journey and try to get into the FBI as a special agent, I would need to be comfortable with firearms. That's when I went and got my first Glock. And I went and I learned how to use it. I got the appropriate training. And from there, it was just anytime I was interested in getting a firearm, whether it was for a hobby or protection, I did it. But I do understand the notion of why certain individuals wouldn't want them. And I can also see the argument against firearms, especially in this day and age. So I can play both sides. I'm never going to give up my guns, but I can understand the concern. And I actually agree with some proponents of gun control law because of what's going on in the world.
So run us through that scenario of going out and getting your first gun, especially in Texas. Obviously, this what you've been through is through Texas. So I'm curious, like, how do you get your permit? What sort of testing do you do? How old do you have to be? Like, let us know and let the viewers know what those rules are in Texas.
Of course, laws change. We're sitting here at the beginning of 2026, and currently we are in a state where open carry is allowed, and you do not need a permit to possess a firearm. Now, back when I had gotten my first gun, there were a little bit more stricter rules on the books. If you wanted to what we call conceal carry, which is have a gun concealed on your person, you would need to actually go get a permit. You would need to go through an appropriate training with a firearm instructor. And it ended up putting even, I want to say, more strict rules on you as a person, not only as it relates to the firearm, but also as it relates to going out and drinking or driving or combinations of the sort, where you could go, where you couldn't go. There were very, very strict limitations when it came to getting your concealed license permit. Now, I made the determination I was not going to get my concealed license because I did not want the restrictions and I knew I wasn't going to carry on my person. I knew that I just wanted to practice with the firearm and I wanted to get comfortable with it. And for the most part, it just stayed in my house. When I went to go purchase it, though, that was an experience because I expected this whole rigmarole of what do I need to do to get this gun? It's going to be days or weeks, and they're going to have to run background checks and they're going to have to figure out my history and credit checks. That wasn't the case at all. I went to Cabela's. Some people might know it as Cabela's or Bass Pro Shop, but I went to Cabela's. I talked with the salesperson. I told him what I wanted. He took my driver's license and he ran a background check. They run a federal background check just to make sure that you don't fall under some of the categories in which you can't get a firearm. And 30 minutes later, I walked out with a Glock. And that was that. There was no registration. There was no formal training. There was no requirement that I show proof of training. And that was actually something that stood out and was kind of scary because, in my opinion, anybody can go get a gun as long as you don't fall into those subcategories. That's where some of the danger comes into play when you're looking at firearms and firearm safety.
Does that make you more worried? Like you said, it was so easy. People out there who may not have the training could also get a gun. Or do you feel more empowered that you're able to get one yourself, or both can happen at the same time, I guess?
It's a little bit of both. I appreciate the fact that me as a law abiding citizen can go out and not be hassled too much if I want to buy a firearm, especially with being in a capitalistic society. I like the fact that if I want something, I can go get it and there's not a lot of restrictions on it. At the same time, it's scary because I've seen people at the shooting range. I've seen teenagers have these weapons and a lot of times they don't have formal training. They just think it's cool to have a rifle or a shotgun or a pistol. And that's where the danger comes in. This was years ago. I was actually going over to a friend's house and her mom had bought her first gun. And the first thing that her mom did, jokingly, is I walked in the room, her mom pointed the gun at me and goes, "Freeze." And I was like, "Oh, okay." And so I was used to firearms. I go, "Oh, can I see it?" And she goes, "Yes, of course." She hands it over to me. I check it and there is a bullet in the chamber. All it would have taken is for her to pull the trigger accidentally and I could have been killed. And so it's those things that scare me when it comes to gun ownership. The fact that there's no required training, at least in Texas, to get a gun. Now, some of the categories that prevent you from getting a weapon, and this is almost a standard across the United States. I'm used to Texas law. Other states, you definitely want to check. But if you are a convicted felon, you can't have a firearm. If you have been involved in domestic abuse from the abuser side or domestic violence, if you've been accused of that and charged and found guilty of domestic violence, can't have a firearm. If you have been found to be mentally incompetent, can't have a firearm. Usually it's if you're under the age of 18, you can't have a firearm. And there's other rules that may exist in other states and other limitations there. But I think without those categories, there's still a lot of people out in the world that I would not trust with a firearm. And that's the crazy thing. You're trusting them with your life or others' lives. And that's what's scary.
Let's dive deeper into that mental, what did you say? What was the term? The mental competence? What falls under that category? Are we talking about depression, anxiety, history of suicide? What are we talking about? There's so many things that can fall under what could be deemed incompetent versus competent, because that is something that is very close into the medical field. We deal with competence all the time with elderly people, dementia, schizophrenia. We have to make those decisions, and it's not an easy decision to make, and it's not something that can be looked at the counter desk and decide, is this person competent enough to have a fire gun? The person that's selling the gun, how do they research that? I can't imagine that's coming from the medical history or their doctor's office notes, because there's no tie and there's HIPAA and there would be violations of that.
Federal law has it instilled to where if you have been adjudicated as mentally defective, or if you were committed to some sort of mental institution in the past, then you cannot legally purchase a firearm. And that's odd because the language of that revolves around going through the court system. If you're adjudicated as mentally defective or incompetent or what have you from the court, that's a judge making that statement based on an assessment that usually a doctor's involved in. But I would be curious as to see what level of maybe self-harm or depression or schizophrenia would have to play in for it to come across a background check and prevent you from getting a firearm. You're a doctor. We've talked about it before where sometimes you might be in with a therapist or a psychiatrist or a psychologist or even your family physician, and you might have something. And just by the very nature of what it might be or what issues that might cause, you might back up and say, hey, let's try to treat it a certain way instead of giving you an official diagnosis because of all the things that might come from it. So that's a very interesting question. And that's also a scary thing because all it takes is some drugs, alcohol, or a bad case of depression to make you not safe with a firearm. And so what is not showing up on that background check that needs to be considered?
It sounds like just the general run of the mill anxiety, depression, something that's mildly there. No one would ever know, and you could
Yeah.
probably still go out and get it.
Now I want to lean into you, who you say that you are not a gun owner, but your husband is. But I take you guys as a team. You are a unit because you're married. So I consider you a gun owner. The guns are in your home. They're around your kids. They're in your possession. If you needed to access it for any reason at all, you could access it. So, what was your experience like growing up? And obviously, you've gone from the north to the south to the northwest to the northeast, back up to the north. You've been all over the country from a standard of living and going through residency and being a doctor. So, what's your experience been like so far?
So my parents absolutely have no interest and no idea how to use a gun. There is no experience in our household at all. I grew up with no involvement of guns. I was not around guns. Even living in Chicago, in the middle of the city, I actually never felt unsafe, and I would say my parents never felt unsafe. Because the way they allowed me to participate in the community was very different in Chicago versus how it changed when we moved to Texas. In Chicago, I was allowed to walk to school a couple blocks away on my own without a parent or an adult around. Whereas when we moved to Texas, absolutely no way I was walking out in the street, playing out on the street on my own ever. And I don't know if that was directly related to gun rules and gun laws in the state, or whether or not it was just because we were moving to a completely new area where we were the minority and we looked different. Again, not quite sure. I've never had that conversation with them, but again, no experience with guns. It was really in college when I was first introduced to guns and firing guns at the gun range. And I had a couple of friends who were very big enthusiasts. They used to go hunting and they wanted to just introduce me and show me how to hold a gun, gun safety. And we shot a couple different types of guns. And I'm not going to be able to name them, but they range from small ones to really, really big ones. I can see the appeal, but I could only see the appeal in shooting it at a gun range. I could not see myself doing that out in public, out hunting. That's not something that I find enjoyment in. And so over the years, I've gone to more gun ranges with friends, again, just to try out different types of guns and just to get a handle on it. Once I met my husband and married into the family, they were a big family of gun owners. I got even more exposure into the backyard, firing into the woods, cans, all that stuff that you normally see or hear about. When we moved here to Wisconsin, we had to actually move these guns, these firearms across different state lines. And it was very interesting to hear my husband discuss changing the permits and getting the names and the states under the right places. Yes, I take full responsibility of being able to safely hold the gun, use the gun, but keep it safe away from my kids as well. We keep the ammo from away from the gun itself. It's never loaded. We have a gun safe and it's locked with a code. It's very hard for the kids to get to, but I know exactly where things are. That's my experience with it. I would say I'm still not a very big gun fan. If it were in my world, the perfect place, I would say no guns at all. But I also understand that we don't live in a community or a country where what I believe is what is there. Everyone has a different belief and a different understanding of it. But I'm still always going to choose and try to live in places where I don't feel like I need to carry one myself. We've landed in a place in the Midwest where it leans purple. It's not too blue, but it's also not too red. The gun laws are not as strict as some places, and people do own guns around here, but I feel safe knowing that and understanding that. Here in Wisconsin, the gun laws for getting a permit are a little bit stricter than Texas. I don't know the exact rules, but I do know that there are some laws here.
So let's investigate that a little bit. Obviously, there are rules for getting guns there. You're not just doing the Lawyer Nik version and walking in, showing your driver's license and walking out 30 minutes later. It sounds like your husband had to actually go in, he had to fill out paperwork, get a permit, get the firearms, and then even when he brought you into the fray, you somehow maybe had to get permitted or at least be aware of these permits, anything like that?
I just had to be aware. He just told me about it. Do not have to get any sort of permit or training or anything to be around the guns. I guess that leads me into the question because we hear this all the time where kids find their parents' guns, they shoot it, something goes wrong. Where in the law, who is in trouble? It sounds like it can be both. Depending on the situation, the minor versus not minor, parent or the actual gun owner. Can you break that down a little bit for us? Let's give you a scenario of where a teenager, let's say a 16-year-old, found a gun, accidentally shoots someone else, injuring them but not killing them. Who is at fault in those situations? And can you say it with a broad stroke, or is it very specific to the state?
I would say it's very specific to the state. We've talked about this before. Each state has the ability to write their own laws. The Second Amendment covers federally. We're all allowed to have guns in our homes. And then when you go through states' laws, the states then start putting the limitations and restrictions and taking into account public policy and cultural norms and so on and so forth. And those were those laws develop. Every state's going to be a little bit different on how they approach. It might be that anybody under the age of 18, if you're not an adult, you should not have access to a gun at all. You cannot fire a firearm without, appropriate supervision, etc. In other states, it might be that you could be 16 and you can have a rifle and you can go hunting by yourself as long as you have a hunting permit, and that's okay. It just depends on the state's laws. Now, in certain situations, depending on those rules, there can be liability on the parents, depending on where you're at. Let's say that my daughter somehow got into my gun safe and grabbed a firearm and was playing with it, or shot at something, or God forbid, harmed another individual or an animal or something of the sort. I could be held civilly liable and I could be held criminally liable for her access, even though she is under the age of 18. Now, she could also be held liable either from a juvenile standard or even be tried as an adult for certain things as well. There is a limitation where a 6-year-old probably isn't going to get tried as an adult, but a 17-year-old may get tried as an adult. You have these different rules that exist from a state to state basis. As usual in law, it just depends what's on the books. I would say overall, though, that when you're looking at kids in general, they don't have the mental capacity. There's a study out there that says for the average male, the brain doesn't stop developing until you're 25 years old. And I actually feel that because when I was 25, I look back now, I'm like, what was I thinking at that age? So when you're a 13, 14, 15-year-old, if you don't have the appropriate training or you don't have the appropriate role models teaching you how to handle a firearm, it poses a threat and there can be dire consequences based on what ends up happening in a situation like that.
How does that lead into permits? I know some places have to have permits. Is that something that you have to have on you in person, or is it something you can just have at home and just say that you are permitted? How does that work in states where they do require you to get a permit?
Again, state by state, you got to look at the penal code. You have to look at the consequences for having a firearm without your permit. Just like driving without a license, by having a driver's license, I have gone through the appropriate testing and the appropriate training to be able to drive. But if I am out driving without a license, it doesn't mean I can't drive, but there might be a penalty for me not having my license on me, whether that's a suspension, whether that's 60 days in jail, or maybe a fine. On top of that, you look at all the other criminal history that gets attached to that. It could just start leveling upon itself as to what was the situation that led to this. I'm sure there are situations in which when you get pulled over by a cop and you say, sorry, I forgot my driver's license at home, they might say, all right, this is a warning. They have discretion. They could send you on your way. Make sure you get home. Make sure you continue to have it. But there are other instances in which you might be driving without a license and you might get arrested, or you might get a ticket. You might get a fine. The same thing would exist with a permit for a firearm. If you have gone through the training, you've gone through the testing to have a permit for a firearm, the rule might be different for you if you are stopped or pulled over and you don't have that license. Some instances, the rule might be more strict on you because you know better. I talked about it a little bit ago in the podcast where sometimes by getting the license and trying to do that thing for the permit, then I'm subjecting myself to stricter rules that come around that firearm. But I would say in general, in states where you have to get a permit, you got to check your state's laws. You got to see if there's a requirement that you have it on you. It might just be good enough to where I have my driver's license. They can tap into a database and say he's got his permit to carry. Or it might be, hey, you know better. You should have had your permit on you. You are carrying. We're going to go ahead and take you in and you're going to be charged with Class A misdemeanor or a Class C felony or something of the sort.
I guess my concern is that we talked about Texas law and how you really didn't need a permit to carry. right? Open carry.
In today's version of Texas in 2026, you do not need a permit to open carry.
Means there are no rules or regulations in terms of how much training you need to have, whether you have that permit or not. That's where I guess would be very concerning for me. Before the episode started, I did ask you if you could look up some of the Minnesota rules. And I know that we weren't going to make this political, but I do think it is very important to bring it into the discussion because of the current events. And I'm just curious, what are the gun laws in Minnesota, and what are the rules and open carry laws that they have there?
You have some standard gun rules. You have to be over the age of 18. You can't be a felon. You can't have mental incompetence. Then it goes the extra step where you need to actually have a permit. I believe it is a may issue permit to carry state. So you have to obtain the permit from your county sheriff to then carry open carry or concealed carry. You have to meet some eligibility requirements, age, residency, disqualifying criminal history. Without diving too far into detail, the requirement is that you need to at least have a permit to have a gun on you. And that's to be juxtaposed against like the Second Amendment right to have firearms. If you are in your home, you can have a firearm. This is specific to carrying outside in the world, the general population.
Then, in your research in Minnesota, is there any sort of requirement for training? Like you have to do so many hours behind the gun shooting to get that training so that you're comfortable with the gun in Minnesota?
I did not come across that at all. It might exist or it might not. I can only base it off the concealed carry perspective in Texas. If you want to conceal carry, you actually had to go do formal training. And at least in Texas, that training consisted of classroom hours as well as shooting range time, where you're with a firearm instructor and they're teaching you how to hold properly and shoot properly and load properly and so on and so forth. But at least in Texas, that was a requirement. I would assume that in other states, especially if you're being a little bit more strict with permits, those types of requirements would probably exist as well.
I'm a little confused. So you do need to go through courses if it's a concealed carry in Texas, but you don't have to go through courses for an open carry.
If you were going to carry on your person, you had to go through formal training to go get the permit. And then that consists of the classroom time, the shooting range time, the firearm instructor time. The law switched to where now you could conceal carry or open carry without any training or without any permit. And that switch, I think, took place 5 years ago. Now you can still go get training. You still go get a carrier's license. There's some benefit to that because then you might see some reciprocity between other states when you travel that still have requirements. By having the carrier's license in Texas, maybe when you're in Oklahoma or Louisiana, who might have stricter gun laws, that can carry over. But at least in Texas, you don't need anything to conceal carry or open carry. I was at Buc-ee's the other day with my wife and a guy walked in with a revolver on his hip. It was holstered, but it was out for the world to see. And now that's becoming a norm because you don't need any additional training. You're just allowed to do it. But that's also scary. That's very scary.
Nick, I do want to bring it back to Minnesota because again, current events, I'm really curious like on the details. I know you said that there is a permit that is required, and is there a rule where you have to take some sort of training? What sort of rules are around concealed carry in Minnesota?
Take this with a grain of salt. I am not a licensed attorney in Minnesota. I have to say that. But from my understanding, first and foremost, open and concealed carry are one and the same. So if you get a permit, it covers both. And then if you're carrying in public without a permit, it's considered a gross misdemeanor. If you do it multiple times, you end up as a felony. Now, granted, other things can probably accentuate that depending on the situation at hand. Now, eligibility, you have to be 21 years or older. In some states, it's 18, but it looks like in Minnesota, it's 21 years. You have to be a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident. You have to complete and submit the application to the county sheriff's office. And then to your question, one of the big things is you have to provide evidence of training. Evidence of training in safe handgun use, it needs to be from a certified instructor, and it needs to be completed within the last year. If you have something that's outdated from years ago, or if your dad just taught you how to shoot, then that's not good enough. You actually have to go through and get firearms training. And then, of course, the typical like not be prohibited from possessing a firearm under state law or federal law. You can't be a felon running around with a handgun. You have to be a resident of the county that you're applying. If you're popping up on like a gang investigation system, that might be a deterrent from you getting a permit. Those are, from what I've seen, the basic requirements to being allowed to have a permit. Again, the county sheriff's office can still make a determination based on extenuating circumstances, but generally speaking, those would be your barriers to entry.
Okay, remember, I'm not a lawyer, so I have a stupid question.
Yeah.
What does gross misdemeanor mean? Like severity wise, is that very like low totem pole? Like what does that mean, gross misdemeanor?
It just depends on the state. There are levels to misdemeanors and there are levels to felonies. You might hear a class C misdemeanor, a class B misdemeanor, class A misdemeanor. And generally speaking, the higher the letter, whether it's A compared to a C, A is going to be more devastating to your criminal record. And then you jump up to felonies. Felonies usually require some jail time. Again, you could have class A, class B, class C. You could have felony one, felony two, felony in the first degree, felony in the second degree. But then you also have these ancillary things that out there. In Texas, we have the state jail felony, and that is a felony where you could end up being in prison for 1 year. So a gross misdemeanor, it's a misdemeanor that is higher up there. It's not your simple traffic infraction. There might be some substantial penalties. And that leads into one of the other questions that you had is what if you are carrying a pistol around and you are eligible, you've gone through the training, you are allowed to have that gun because of the permit, but you don't have the permit with you? There's two different standards. You have carrying without a permit, and that's basically you are not eligible. You have not received the training. You have not submitted an application for the permit. You're just not permitted to carry a firearm. That penalty for a gross misdemeanor can be maximum up to 1 year in jail and or a $3,000 fine. And then, of course, if there's aggravating factors on top of that, whether you're a felon, multiple offenses could get even worse. If you're carrying with the permit, but you don't have it physically on your person, you're still held to a standard where there's a violation there. It's a gross misdemeanor, but it's treated less severely in most cases than carrying without a permit. You get some leeway for being eligible for actually going through the training and being permitted, but you're still going to get a citation. You might still get a fine. I'm not sure if jail time would be on the table, but I would assume you might have to go to jail for a little bit, or you might not. It just depends on the situation. With that, I know that we talked about Minnesota, and I know that there's debate with the instance with Preddy and ICE as to whether or not he was allowed to have a firearm, like he was permitted, but also was the firearm on him? Was it not on him? Was he brandishing it? Was he not brandishing it? That's where a lot of the debate in America comes from a firearm perspective. There are so many different instances, whether you're in law enforcement, whether you're protecting yourself, whether you're utilizing castle doctrine and defending your home, of where firearms come into play. And if people don't understand their laws, they can be held criminally liable to an extent where you might face severe jail time. You might face felonies to where now you're no longer allowed to have a firearm ever. And of course, you have limitations to being a felon. Or you might put yourself in the path of a law enforcement agent or a law enforcement officer where they feel threatened or they can claim that they feel threatened. And from there, you might lose your life or end up severely injured by that very nature. When it comes to firearms in general, training first and foremost would go a long way. Permits are good and bad, because I do think that having a training requirement is important. In Texas, if I could change one thing, I would say that before you went to go get a firearm, you should have some sort of classroom training on how to handle that firearm, how to properly carry that firearm. What's the rule on having it in a holster versus having it in your pocket versus displaying it in the back of your pickup truck? It needs to be rules regarding training. But that's where the debate comes from. When you're looking at it from a protection standpoint, how are you using it? What's your feeling on, firearms in general? Because if we break it down, you have the hobbyist, and it sounds like you fall into the hobbyist. You enjoy shooting firearms. It's the same reason that people go to the gun range, go shoot bow and arrows, go axe throwing. You're trying to test your skills against things that you may not have a lot of access to. And it's fun. Shooting guns is actually fun. Trying to hit a target, trying to see how good you are. It's a fun experience. But then you also have the home protection aspect. You have the hunting aspect. You have the straight, I am American, this is my right aspect. What do you think of those different categories? Is there a category as far as your opinions toward firearms that you disagree with?
It's funny because we talked about not being political, but I guess the conversation always leads down that direction. But I just don't understand how we can continue to perpetuate the need for more guns when it's literally the guns causing deaths. And I know some people will argue that it's actually the person holding or handling the gun. But if we got rid of majority of the guns, it would help the situation. That's what we see in other countries. And so it's a hard conversation to have. I understand that in this scenario or the situation that we're in now where the entire country has guns, I would rather we have rules and limitations on how much training they have. That would make me feel better. But like you
And
said, in a state like of Texas where you don't really need any training, that really worries me. That is what gives me pause. And so I wish it were better. But again, bringing it back to the situation that happened with Preddy, he had a permit, he had a gun, rightfully, and because someone else found that he was a threat, he was shot and killed. But if we look into past things that have occurred in our history, January 6th, or even Kyle Rittenhouse, when they were physically carrying guns around, holding it in their hands, and nothing happened to them, those are the scenarios where it just becomes really difficult to swallow. And it's just hard to say, oh, yeah, everyone should just be carrying a gun because not all of us are treated similarly in these different scenarios.
And I also think to that point, there's differences at play when you're talking about law enforcement or federal officers. That's a big debate in our country right now. I would love to trust law enforcement. I would love to trust all law enforcement, but I always go back to just like there are good lawyers and bad lawyers and good doctors and bad doctors, there's good law enforcement and bad law enforcement. There is this dynamic of standing up for your rights, or at least what you think your rights are. I mean, there are some instances where people will stand up for the rights. They know their rights. They've read the Constitution. They understand the laws, and they have a very, very good backing. It doesn't necessarily mean that the person across from you also has that understanding. Again, not legal advice, and I know this pains people, but when it comes to law enforcement, I would much rather any client of mine or any family member or myself adhere to the law enforcement aspect, even if it's a violation, and then go handle it in court. Because it's not worth losing my life over, because I have to trust that the other person across from me is not going to do something egregious. So if I can be compliant, even if I disagree, even if things are getting a little bit forceful, I have to remember that I have recourse after it. But the moment that I start doing things that go against it, I'm putting myself at the beck and call of the other individual. I don't know if that officer has had a bad day. I don't know if he's pissed off at the world. I don't know if he's looking for a fight, or I don't know if he's mentally incompetent and mentally unstable. I mean, we talked about that earlier. There are a lot of law enforcement officers that are depressed and suffer from PTSD and have gone through it. I don't want to be a target. And so what's the easiest way for me is to comply. And I would rather have people comply, fight it afterwards, even knowing that it's wrong. But I also see the other side, because our nation was born standing up to tyranny. Our nation came from standing up for what we believe in and what's right, and having those firearms accessible to then basically get our freedom, get our independence. When you look at what our nation is grounded in, there is a bit of don't tread on me. Don't bring your federal officers in here and start commanding me around. I go back and forth because it's important to have the protests and speak your mind and utilize free speech. But you also are playing a deadly game in some instances because you're trying to predict what the other side's going to do. And sometimes the other side, it's a bad officer and you get shot. Other times it's a good officer and you have a great experience. Not to be political, I know people are going to hate the fact that I said that, where it's comply. But my life, my family's life, my clients' lives, it's not worth the 10 seconds of misunderstanding. It's not worth that. I would much rather chase it afterwards. And in most cases, these people are coming out with a pretty penny. They're able to sue the county, sue the state, and they're getting paid for it. They're getting paid for the transgression, the constitutional violation. And I would much rather be that situation than have me or one of my family members hurt from it.
I want to push back on that only because it's just hard because it's up to interpretation at that moment in time. These two scenarios that I'm specifically thinking of is the Minnesota recent shooting where the guy is on the ground on his knees, one hand with his phone, and then the other hand is on the ground bracing himself. Like he got shot. Whereas these people at January 6th, they were brandishing weapons and actually physically hitting cops and security. It's just these two scenarios that are very eerily similar where there are protests, but one was quite obviously violent and not a lot of mass deaths from it. It's just hard to swallow to think that these two scenarios had such different outcomes and results, and that people are trying to wrap their minds around it and just make it fit their narrative on both sides. both
Yeah.
sides, no matter what political side you are on. It's just very frustrating and very annoying, which is why I wanted to have this conversation with you, because I really wanted to understand gun laws and rules across our country a little bit more. And honestly, I come out of it even more confused and even a little bit more worried because it's so different among every state. It's just so different.
I'm not being an ICE apologist here, but you said it's up to interpretation. And this actually came from an experience I had in law school. We actually had a law enforcement officer come in, and it was a criminal defense attorney and a prosecutor, and they were doing like a panel. And one of the things that we were talking about was, when is it appropriate for a law enforcement officer to discharge their firearm? To basically address a threat. And so we played this game, and I think that they go through this in training when they're becoming a police officer or law enforcement officer, where it was a video screen and you had these instances of you're watching almost a first person view of somebody approaching you. And in the moment, you're trying to determine whether or not they're a threat. And so they start getting closer and you're looking and you can't really see what's in their hand. And so they said, all right, you're going to put up your gun. And then when you would fire at this person, if you would fire at this person, I want you to slam your hand on the desk. And so you have a classroom full of law students going through this process. These scenarios were all based on real life instances where in that moment, the officer was shot, was stabbed, was killed, was harmed. And so based on when the officer actually engaged the suspect, that determined whether or not that officer went home to their family. And it was all across the board of the interpretation of, okay, are they a threat now? Are they a threat later? Was that a gun? Was that a knife? And it was stressful. It was kind of a not traumatizing experience, but a very eye-opening experience. When I try to put my lawyer hat on, obviously I can really feel for the individual in Minnesota. Obviously he lost his life, and that's a tragedy. And then I look at what was going on with the ICE agents, and I think, were they properly trained? Are they going through the appropriate training? Did they get enough sleep? Was it the fact that he was not complying and resisting just a little bit and somebody saw a gun, but there's 10 guns around them because you're looking at the butts of all the other law enforcement officers all around you? It's all interpretation. At what point did somebody feel like there was a threat? And this is where I go back. The man still lost his life. And that's hard to stomach because, again, peaceful protests. I'm a fan of peaceful protesting. I'm a fan of the First Amendment. And it's hard to stomach because is that a life that should have been lost? Absolutely not. But I can't put myself in the position of a federal agent and understand what they were going through that day and understand the responsibility and pressure. So all we're left to do is try to interpret. I think this is something that Americans do very poorly. We get the information and immediately we want to make a judgment call on what was right, what was wrong. And usually that first 5 or 10 minutes after something happens doesn't get corrected down the line. Even though updated facts might come out after the investigation 6 months, 7 months, 8 months later, harm has already been there. The initial 5 or 10 minutes after that situation where it's blasted on Twitter and it's blasted on Facebook and TikTok and Instagram, that stays with people. So even 5 or 6 months down the line, you could come out with the fact that he actually had a firearm and he was trying to shoot somebody and the ICE agents did exactly what they should do. They're not going to remember that. Or it could be the exact opposite, where he didn't have any gun on him at all. He was completely unarmed, and what they saw was a cell phone. Again, it's going to be the first 5 to 10 minutes, and that's going to hold with people. People aren't good at going back and checking and adjusting what actually happened. They hear the storyline, they hear the snippet, then that's their opinion of it, and they don't really recognize the fact that in the next coming months, there's other information that comes out, body cam footage, reports, third-person testimony. There's so much more that goes into it, and they just don't want to educate themselves on what actually happened. We just let it flow into the ether, and our opinion is set after the first 5 minutes.
This has been a great conversation, but the one thing that I want to end on is just the frustration that I have and just the narrative of all this. This guy was legally carrying a gun that he had a permit for, and that's what a lot of Americans want, is that you have the ability to do that. But now that he has been shot and half of the narrative is saying that, oh, he shouldn't have brought the gun to this area because then it shows that he had intent to do some harm. But the whole point of carrying is to protect yourself. What if he carried it to be defensive? And so it's the same people who were saying, oh, we got to protect our Second Amendment rights and we should be able to allow to carry and defend ourselves, that are the same people saying, oh, he deserved to die because he had a gun on him anyway. So then what I see is that everyone should agree that no one should have guns. If that's the argument we're going to have, is that no one should carry because then everyone would be safe. No one would be walking around with the intent to kill or the intent to harm. It's just frustrating. It's backwards. It's annoying, both
Yeah.
sides. This whole situation, everything that's going on, especially around the gun laws, it's just becoming way too political, and it's turning up the fire too much.
To that point, I have this recurring thought, as a lawyer, I'm always thinking, but there's a situation in which you can imagine a police officer serving an arrest warrant and they have the wrong address. And you, as a homeowner, you think people are breaking in and you open fire on police officers. And just because they have the wrong address, they are then going to see you as a threat and open fire on you. And when the dust has settled, you protecting your home and your family, them getting the address wrong, people are dead at that point. I definitely see that to where you are exercising your right. You believe you have the ability to exercise that right. You're doing it appropriately, and you're still considered a threat. It's a very interesting conversation. We could go into more detail, but we're getting to the end of it. I just want to point out, though, one thing to consider. And a lot of people don't consider this because we are introspective as a nation. When you talk about removing all guns, there's also the intent of people being malicious. One thing that I found very interesting lately is that apparently there's this epidemic of stabbings in the UK where obviously they don't have guns, but these individuals are still committing these horrendous atrocities of stabbing people, killing people, carrying around hatchets or knives or even machetes in some instances. And I would want to do more research as to what is the fallout there. Is it, when you're comparing knives in a population that is not very pro-gun compared to a population like America that is very pro-gun, are there different safety standards? Is there a different mortality rate that exists? If I'm faced between a gun and a knife, I'd probably want to face a knife. But I'd just be cognizant of the malicious intent. That's the worst part of this whole thing, and my biggest frustration with guns in general is that criminals don't care about permits. They don't care about gun laws. They don't care about any of that. A criminal is going to find a gun and they're going to carry a gun. And if they have malicious intent, they're going to use that gun. And so that is the thing that keeps me up at night when we're talking about firearms. Whether or not, regardless of permitting, I'm going to be able to use my weapon to protect myself against the malicious people that have that criminal intent and don't really care about where that gun's coming from and the permits that are needed. That's my biggest worry when it comes to firearms.
Got it. Again, we have a lot to work towards, a lot to better improve our country, but I think that's a great place to end our conversation. Again, thank you for joining us here on the Medical Legal Brief. If you haven't already, make sure you subscribe, follow, like. We are on Spotify. We are definitely on YouTube and all the other social media accounts as well. So please find us. We always post a new episode on Wednesdays at 10 Central Time. So look for the next episode. We appreciate you joining us. Yes, we're doctors. Yes, we're lawyers. No, this podcast is not medical or legal advice. Do not take anything we say as a reason to perform your own heart surgery, represent yourself in court, or diagnose your neighbor's rash. This is for entertainment only. Think of it like hanging out with your smartest, wittiest friends, not a substitute for an actual appointment. If you act on anything we say without talking to your own professional, that's on you. Seriously, don't do that.